right, thank you very much. Thank you, Robert, for that kind introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming here tonight and bypassing the Republican National Convention. I'm sure that was a tough call for many of you. And thanks, of course, to Summer Sessions, to Michelle and the great staff there at Summer Sessions for the invitation and for putting together all these great events for us to enjoy. So what I've got for you is a lecture. I was telling Robert before, I timed it out at home at about 45 minutes. That means when I'm up here gesticulating and going off on tangents, it's probably going to be about an hour. This is a condensed version of my dissertation, and a few months ago when I started pulling my notes together and making an outline for this presentation, I thought, oh, this is good, I'll put this in, and oh yeah, I want to tell this story and put that in, and I ended up with an outline for a 4.5-hour lecture. So I had to cut back significantly, but I've chosen a couple of key moments, a couple of highlights in the history of salmon fisheries in Alaska to talk about tonight. So I'll talk for probably about an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answer after that. All right, so let's get going. Shortly after the end of the Second World War, the editors of Pacific Fisherman, a Seattle-based politically engaged trade publication, commented on the now peaceful Pacific and its supposedly limitless resources. Quote, "The Pacific Ocean is one of Earth's last frontiers. The United States has a national stake in it by virtue of geographical position and because we poured out lives beyond number and wealth beyond measure to bring it peace." Close quote. Now, the perspectives and assumptions that are embedded in that editorial, entitled "Who Will Harvest the Pacific?" glorify an idealized past in which hardy pioneers settled the penultimate frontier in the American West. And the magazine also embraces a type of American exceptionalism where commercial expansion into the Pacific had been earned through military sacrifice, if not predestined altogether. A new generation of pioneers, such as the Bristol Bay gillnetter pictured here, were poised to conquer the Pacific. This was not merely a post-World War II phenomenon, however. From the very beginnings of the North Pacific commercial salmon fishery in the 1880s, the Seattle-based packers expanded their reach into new regions of the open ocean and sought to establish proprietary interests by demarcating what they viewed as open, virgin maritime space with boundaries that reflected their commercial interest and also disadvantaged or outright excluded others, especially indigenous peoples and foreign fishermen. Now, sometimes these boundaries were based on natural environmental forms, such as the continental shelf. Other times they were artificial constructs, arrow-straight borders that followed lines of latitude and longitude. But whatever the case, the borders on the open ocean, and more specifically the processes behind their creation, replicated in many ways the white settlement of the American West and the triumphalism that undergirded that enterprise. The histories of both terrestrial and maritime expansion involved resource development by private industry, support of the federal government, and most significantly for my presentation tonight, the application of science and technology to compartmentalize and commodify the natural environment. In this presentation, I will show you that the production of scientific knowledge concerning Alaska salmon was central to the creation of maritime borders, but that the nature of that knowledge, and thus the nature of the borders themselves, was not dispassionate and value-free, as we often expect science to be, but rather subjective, constructed, manipulated, and ultimately conjoined with US political prerogatives and commercial interests. Now, it's not going to surprise any of you that throughout history, the US government and private enterprise sought to expand territory. That's not exactly news. What I'm offering tonight is a look at how the ever-growing base of knowledge about salmon, a species of fish that has fascinated and perplexed scientists for more than a century, has, in this one limited context, facilitated that territorial expansion. Owning the ocean, to take the title of my presentation. In the 1890s, almost nothing was known about the life cycles of salmon. Their migrations, growth patterns, spawning habits, nothing. And as we learned more and more about salmon, it altered our views of the ocean environment and caused us at different moments in history to attempt to control with borders this unknowable species of fish and the uncontrollable sea. Excuse me, commercial fishing in Alaska began quite small, just a single cannery in Klawock in 1878. And in fact, commercial operations remained relatively limited throughout the early 1900s, largely a function of economic and logistical difficulties of building, processing, and canning facilities in the pre-territorial hinterlands of Alaska. And yet, early salmon fishing in Southeast, Kodiak Island, and Bristol Bay made clear the potential for overharvest and destruction of the runs, especially when fishermen used traps or barricades or other brutally efficient gear. Howard Coen, an agent of the U.S. Fisheries Bureau, conducted surveys and inspections of salmon habitat and also canneries in the 1890s. And his findings make an excellent starting point for our project precisely because so little was known about salmon at that time. Now, Coen was not a scientist by training, and in fact, it was very common in this era for the U.S. Fisheries Bureau, this is the precursor to the Fish and Wildlife Service, to charge its agents, essentially game wardens, with the collection of scientific information. Coen's investigations were largely limited to interviewing cannery workers, collecting anecdotal information about this or that year's catch. In 1897, in response to a query about the then unsubstantiated theory that adult salmon return to their native streams to spawn, Coen wrote that his observations and statistics provided by cannery officials, quote, do not support this hypothesis, end quote. He added that wild fluctuations in the numbers of salmon in different streams from year to year, quote, may raise the interesting question whether hitherto commonly accepted theories are not quite fallacious, and that the salmon, instead of unerringly returning to their spawning grounds, have no such habits, but on the contrary may diffuse themselves throughout all communicating waters. While acknowledging that he had seen no scientific method applied to the question, the agent posited that fry hatched from every stream and river in a given district might commingle in the open ocean, grow to adulthood and sexual maturity, and then enter not the stream of their birth, but whichever freshwater inlet presented before them and allowed easy access. Another agent, John Nathan Cobb, who similarly had no scientific training, but would nevertheless go on to be the first dean of the University of Washington School of Fisheries. That's not a dig at my institution, it really isn't. Collaborated with a hatchery superintendent in 1903 to mark 1,600 red salmon fry by clipping their ventral fins with small scissors. 3 and then 4 years later, they observed just 1% of returning adult fish were missing both ventral fins. The finding, though not exactly scientifically rigorous in the manner that we would expect today, proved important to fisheries managers at the time for 2 reasons. First, it contributed to the theory that salmon runs occur in 3 or 4 or more year cycles. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then second, the low return of these marked fish, just 1%, suggested to Cobb, quote, that while a part of a given catch of salmon may return to the parent stream, a greater part may go to other streams of the region. Now, all of this background, which you recognize as being completely factually incorrect, is background for a scientist that I want to spend some time talking about this evening. Stanford University ichthyologist Charles Henry Gilbert. Gilbert studied under the renowned David Starr Jordan, a man who in 1904 advocated for the professionalization of the field. Accordingly, Dr. Gilbert entered the field of Alaska salmon studies and made a great leap forward with microscopic examination of salmon scales. Now, he was not the discoverer of this phenomenon, but he did pioneer the technique. Gilbert noted that scales feature growth rings, much like the rings of a tree, that indicate by their width and by their spacing the pattern of growth over the course of the salmon's life. This king salmon scale, for example, collected by Gilbert on the Yukon River in 1920, shows tightly grouped rings at the very center, showing the relatively slow growth that occurred as the newly hatched fry made its way from freshwater downriver to the ocean. Upon entering the nutrient-rich ocean, the fish begins feeding voraciously, growing markedly, a fact reflected in the greater spacing of its rings. The rings offered such a precise record of the growth of the fish throughout its life that Gilbert was able to conclusively determine certain runs spent 3 or 4 or more years at sea before returning to spawn. The exact duration depended on a number of factors, including species, habitat, water temperature, and so forth. And the cycles appeared, however, to have great predictability, especially for government regulators. A strong red salmon run in the Nushagak in 1910, for example, would likely result in a similarly strong run in 1914, when the large numbers of fry hatched 4 years earlier themselves returned as adults to spawn. But this would only be true, Gilbert realized, if in fact salmon always returned to the streams of their birth, still not a settled question. In 1913, Gilbert wrote to canneries throughout Alaska, asking the foreman to collect scales and then mail them to Stanford University. He instructed the cannery man on how to remove the scales, from which part of the fish he wanted the scales taken, and then how they should be packaged and shipped. I believe, Gilbert wrote to his mentor, Dr. Jordan, that a comprehensive examination of scales from salmon taken from different waters and geographically distinct regions might settle once and for all the debate regarding native streams. In 1920, Gilbert had an opportunity for a real-world test of his salmon scale theories. The Carlisle Packing Company of Seattle operated a floating salmon cannery at the mouth of the Yukon in 1918 and 1919. And this cannery, although its pack was relatively small, just 3.4 million pounds total, was blamed for poor fish runs upriver that left both native and white Alaskans well short of the salmon they needed both for personal consumption and also to feed their dog teams. Dr. Gilbert was commissioned by the U.S. Fisheries Bureau to go to Alaska and, quote, inspect the spawning runs as these enter the mouth of the river, and to ascertain by microscopic examination of the scales as much as this method can furnish of the life history of Yukon salmon, close quote. Gilbert's orders continue. The primary object of the expedition was to ascertain the advisability of permitting the operation of one or more salmon canneries on the Yukon, in view of the possibility that they might so curtail the salmon supply that it would fail to provide natives and white inhabitants as well with the stores of fish that they find essential under the rigorous conditions of the far northern climate. Now, this is a fascinating story for reasons well beyond the science involved. The controversy over the Carlisle cannery was not merely about fish, but came to encompass social issues and cultural issues involving Alaska natives, missionaries, the education of native children, and many others. It also offers a penetrating insight to white-native relations of this time period. Gilbert's orders make clear that the welfare of Yukon River natives was of primary importance to the federal government. But per the paternalistic attitudes of the government that were common of the day, we see that Gilbert and the Fisheries Bureau worked for native interests, but not with natives themselves. In 1919, the year before Gilbert's study, the Fisheries Bureau distributed questionnaires to individuals living along the Yukon in the hopes of gathering anecdotal information about the quality of fish runs. Here you see two questions from that survey. In your opinion, has the run of salmon been affected by the cannery? Do you believe continued operation will seriously affect the supply? And so on and so forth. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, of the 68 questionnaires distributed by the Bureau's agent, not a single one went to an Alaska Native. Calvin Townsend, the game warden you see here, tried to give them to people that would fill them out faithfully and forward them to the Bureau as requested. Apparently, it was believed Alaska Natives were not capable of providing input and completing this task. Now, missionaries, of course, were consulted and steadfastly advocated for what they viewed as their native charges. Julius Jetty from Tanana, for example, whose testimony was clearly informed by conversations he had with Gilbert, noted the following: I think the results should be watched for at least 5 years before passing a judgment on the matter, which is precisely what Charles Henry Gilbert himself believed. And Hudson Stuck, the famed archdeacon of the Yukon, took aim directly at the Fisheries Bureau, complaining the director had gone on record stating, quote, neither power to permit nor power to prohibit the cannery is lodged in his bureau, but only power to regulate. It is obvious, however, that the power to regulate, if sufficiently drastically exercised, is the power to prohibit. I do not care to argue about words. In Gilbert's expedition journal, he exhibits a remarkable scientific curiosity about the Yukon River and its environment, as we would expect for a professional scientist of his standing. But he also diminishes Alaska Natives for whom he is ostensibly laboring. In several places in his journal, he laments what he calls the improvidence and the ingratitude of natives. They, quote, they, natives, can make much money trapping if they will only take the trouble. Some few of them are industrious and do well, but the majority care only for the day at hand and are wholly improvident, close quote. Sentiments such as this one run throughout not only Gilbert's papers, but all records of the Yukon River study. And they demonstrate that issues of salmon and science in Alaska cannot be extricated from race. I'll say much more about this a little bit later in my presentation. Now I'm going to jump to the end of the story here. But before I do, let me say one more thing about Gilbert's journal. He met many people along the Yukon that summer, including a young biologist he met in St. Michael on July 26, 1920, whom he refers to in his journal as Mr. Murie. This, of course, is Olaus Murie, who later with his wife Marty was a pioneering conservationist in Alaska. Seems appropriate to bring up here considering the building in which we now sit. And you see here he refers to him as a very bright young fellow intensely interested in his work. Now to jump to the end of the story, Dr. Gilbert could not definitively prove that the cannery was to blame for poor fish runs. He said a multi-year study was necessary to answer that question. But in an abundance of caution, he recommended the cannery be shut down, which is exactly what the Fisheries Bureau ordered. What is significant for our purposes here is that in the context of scientific research, Gilbert examined salmon scales from dozens of villages and fish camps all along the river, and his findings revealed something important about the freshwater to saltwater and then back to freshwater migrations of salmon. It's important to note that at this time, almost nothing was known of the ocean migrations of salmon. It was believed by many that salmon linger at the mouths of the freshwater streams in which they were hatched, for all of their adult lives, never traveling more than 10 or perhaps 20 miles from those native streams. Gilbert wondered, however, if they venture far out into the open sea, and if so, how far? And if they do swim far out to sea, by what mechanism do they find their way back to Alaska itself, never mind the stream of their birth? Gilbert found that the Yukon River salmon showed in their scales almost no growth from the winter of the year they spawn. Now this gets a little bit technical, so stick with me. And keep in mind, you're hearing from a historian, not an ichthyologist here. Yukon River salmon enter the river in May or June when the river is ice-free. And the fact that their scales showed no growth from the winter check before suggested to Gilbert that the fish lingered in the Bering Sea, where the cold waters provided fewer nutrients than warmer waters to the south. Quote, under such adverse conditions, growth during the winter season must be at or near a standstill, and in the spring might well not be resumed before the beginning of the streamward migration. In the event that scales would exhibit no growth accomplished during the year in which the fish was captured, close quote. Yet, of course, the fish grew markedly in the years between its birth and when it spawned, which indicated that prior to its re-entrance to the Bering Sea, it must have migrated to the warmer and nutrient-rich waters of Bristol Bay, the Alaska Peninsula, the North Pacific. Gilbert did not know. By examining salmon scales from Bristol Bay and other areas south of the Yukon River, Gilbert observed widely spaced rings beyond that winter check, indicating the salmon, quote, have already responded to spring conditions and have begun a period of rapid growth, closed quote. This suggested that Bristol Bay salmon, at least, do not linger in the bay from their final winter on, but rather feed as they migrate from more southern waters. Gilbert now recognized that in the years salmon spend in the ocean, they migrate much, much farther in terms of distance from natal stream as well as cumulative miles than anyone had previously guessed. Of course, he knew nothing of where exactly salmon migrated, and in an effort to track their migratory routes, Gilbert, beginning in 1922, affixed metal numbered tags to the tails of over 10,000 adult salmon. And he then asked fishermen and cannery workers throughout the territory to record the number, date, and location of any tags recovered in their nets. In this way, the salmon themselves are the scientific instruments deployed by Gilbert. Now, in summarizing this complex multi-year study, I have to summarize greatly, forgive me, but in essence, these tags turned up in 20 different watersheds, from Cook Inlet to Kodiak to Akutan to Bristol Bay and the Yukon River. Wrote Gilbert, quote, if the homing instinct prevails, we are compelled to accept an extremely wide dispersal of the young to the feeding grounds, hundreds of miles distant. And at the close of their period of growth and development, at the beginning of the season in which their eggs and milk will ripen, we must figure them leaving the feeding grounds and independently retracing the hundreds of miles which may separate them from their native streams. Okay, so I'm 25 minutes into this presentation. You may have noticed I haven't said a whole lot about the borders that were advertised at the beginning. So here we go, I promise. Gilbert's scale and tagging studies revealed on a very basic level that each river and stream contained what he called a distinct race of salmon. The growth pattern on scales from salmon hatched in the Yukon Delta, for example, would be different from that found on scales of fish hatched near Fort Yukon, the difference being the hundreds of miles quite literally etched on the fish itself. The same would theoretically be true for salmon hatched in Wood Lakes versus those from the Agigic. It would therefore be possible to manage salmon fisheries, not as a conglomerated whole, but rather on a river by river, stream by stream, tributary by tributary basis. And this leads us to the first comprehensive attempt by the federal government to both manage and conserve salmon fisheries. And this attempt is the Alaska Fisheries Reservations you see pictured here. Don't be fooled by the term reservations. This has nothing to do with Alaska Natives. Now, by the early 1920s, both the federal government and private industry realized that some form of conservation-based management was necessary to provide for the long-term sustainability of the species. Alaska at this time was an open access fishery, meaning anyone with legal gear could participate. And during World War I, the promise of guaranteed contracts from a federal government buying all the canned salmon it could to feed troops and civilians in war-torn Europe had led to rampant overfishing. The number of canneries in Alaska alone more than doubled from 54 in 1910 to 121 just 8 years later. The total production during the war in a single year topped 486 million pounds. The open access policy and the inability of the Fisheries Bureau to effectively regulate the industry, hamstrung as it was by an ineffective 1906 law, stood to destroy salmon stocks throughout the territory. The Department of Commerce, of which the Fisheries Bureau was a part, responded in 1922 by establishing the fisheries reservations you see pictured here. Watersheds and the surrounding ocean, demarcated as you see with arbitrary boundaries, the fishing rights for which were to be allocated on a permit basis. Commercial operators such as the Carlisle Company I mentioned before, the Alaska Packers Association, and many others were not quite grandfathered into this system, but established canneries in the region did receive permits and harvest limits that the Fisheries Bureau intended to revise each year based on the predictions of the run by men like Gilbert himself. Permits were also available to resident fishermen, including natives, though with any such limited entry system, there are bound to be those who are excluded. Here, so you're looking here at the Alaska Peninsula Fisheries Reservations. You see each stream, each watershed demarcated with boundaries, and in each of those districts, permits would be allocated to the operators. And here you see the southwestern Alaska, divisions between Bristol Bay, Cook Inlet, and the Kodiak-Afognak district. And within each district, then, it is further demarcated into zones. Dr. Gilbert fully endorsed the reservation system. Having proven that anadromous salmon return to spawn in their natal streams, Gilbert believed that even aerostraight borders, such as those pictured here, would still be effective so long as the catch of salmon occurred only at the mouths of the rivers. The fish could commingle in the open ocean. They could cross these arbitrary borders as much as they wanted to. They could even migrate to Tierra del Fuego for all he cared. But they would always come back, and thus they could be regulated on the basis of the race and the stream to which they belonged. So these borders then, when it comes right down to it, are not really even about fish. These borders are about people. They created zones of inclusion and zones of exclusion. Categories that, although ostensibly defined or founded on scientific data, neutral, dispassionate, value-free science, were actually rooted in politics and in a capitalist system where you can be assured that the Alaska Packers Association, based in San Francisco, California, never once had a permit application turned down by the Bureau, but that the Swedish immigrant who married an Alaska Native woman and had a Japanese fishing partner on the Nushagak, he might. I was really hoping that Terrence Cole would be here. Terrence isn't here, is he? Terrence loves when I go all Marxist in my lectures. So that last bit was for Terrence right there.
Not known for sitting quietly.
All right. So the fisheries reservation system lasted only a couple of years. In 1924, Congress passed the White Act, which vested greater regulatory authority with the Secretary of Commerce. Now, I'm going to bypass the White Act tonight. It's been written about many times before, most notably, I think, by Richard Cooley in his classic Politics and Conservation. But for our purposes here, the most significant part of the White Act was that it authorized the Fisheries Bureau to enact whatever regulations it deemed necessary to achieve 50% escapement of all fish species in Alaska. Essentially, for every fish caught by a fisherman, another one had to be allowed to escape to its spawning grounds. Now, the 50% number was itself arbitrary and, in fact, impossible to achieve because counting fish populations at the time simply could not be done. But by regulating certain types of gear, the Fisheries Bureau established a new form of border on the ocean. Bristol Bay gillnetters, for example, who you see pictured here, were prohibited from using motorized vessels. Thus, all fishing after 1924 was to be conducted by boats under sail. The regulations also limited the length of gill nets to just 900 feet. And so a sailboat with a 900-foot gill net establishes a very precise spatial geography that came to dominate the perspectives of Bristol Bay fishermen. These perspectives came into full view when the Japanese invaded Bristol Bay in 1937. On July 6th of that year, the Tayo Maru, a 6,000-ton processing vessel you see pictured here, and a couple of dozen tenders that you see in the upper left, entered Bristol Bay intent on participating in the red salmon fishery, then and today the most productive and valuable salmon fishery in the world. Although the boats, the Japanese vessels, stayed in international waters outside of the 3-mile territorial limit, they were still perceived as having invaded and stolen Alaska salmon. Here you see another photograph of the Tayo Maru, this time with gill nets spread over the bow to dry. 5 Alaska fishermen took to the air in a float plane, and they're the ones who took these pictures. And when they flew over the processing vessels, they observed fish boxes, which I've indicated with red arrows here, and they estimated the total catch from all the vessels at 20,000 fish. Now, these Alaska fishermen, not to mention members of Congress and territories' newspapers, fishermen's unions, everyone who had an opinion on the matter, invariably referred to this as an invasion. But if it was an invasion, it was neither secret nor a surprise. As early as 1930, Japanese vessels had entered Bristol Bay and fished for crab, a fishery for which there was no American fishery at the time. A little bit ironic considering how productive and valuable the crab fishery would become. And in addition, in 1936, after long expressing an economic interest in other species found in Alaska's extraterritorial waters, the Japanese Diet authorized a multi-year scientific study of the salmon fishery in Bristol Bay. That year, a number of vessels, the size and configuration of the Tayo Maru, visited the region. Now, what set the events of July 1937 apart was that these vessels had been observed and photographed having harvested large numbers of salmon, which could only be for commercial, not scientific purposes. In this next section of my presentation, then, I'm going to be speaking about politics, culture, and identity more than science. But you will notice the extent to which the theories of Charles Henry Gilbert and other ichthyologists that I've not had time to mention have entered the public discourse. In effect, science becomes translated into both public policy as well as the identities of those who participate in the fishery. Here then is Bristol Bay, 45,000 square miles, fed by half a dozen major rivers and many smaller ones. In the 1930s, the annual salmon pack in Bristol Bay had a value of $12 million, and tax receipts from this industry accounted for as much as 77% of total revenue for the territory. Bristol Bay alone accounted for 1/3 of all territorial revenue from commercial fishing, What you're looking at here is a map, and the lines here show the approximate migrations of the salmon, though still poorly understood. The circles and the squares on the map indicate the position of those Japanese fishing vessels in 1936 and 1937. Anthony Diamond, Alaska's non-voting territorial delegate to Congress, introduced protectionist legislation that would define the Bristol Bay fishery as American and would exclude fishermen from all foreign nations. A key element of Diamond's bill was the assertion that because the anadromous salmon began life as hatchlings in Alaska's rivers and lakes, the same waters in which they would spawn and die years later, they remained the property of the United States even when they traveled to the open ocean as part of their life cycle. Although Diamond's bill did not pass into law, it provided an important context for understanding the conceptual border that separates a state's coastal waters from the open ocean. In a speech on the House floor in May of 1937, Diamond noted that enough investigation has been made of the life history and the habits of salmon to know beyond any question of doubt that they are salmon bound for the rivers which flow into Bristol Bay. They are our property. The Japanese, not surprisingly, took a different view. In February of 1937, T. Takasaki traveled to Seattle, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., and invited American fishing interests to jointly finance a commercial fishing operation in Bristol Bay. In outlining his view of the non-proprietary nature of the anadromous fish species, Takasaki stated, "When the salmon once goes out into the open sea, we may not be able to claim it as our property, no matter who may catch it. May this not hold true in the similar case when the salmon has grown up in the open sea, and is caught there by other nationalities, regardless of whether or not it was spawned in a United States hatchery. May Americans claim that such fish is actually their property." Now, Diamond possessed an Alaska-centric view of the salmon, believing that because the fry hatched in territorial rivers, they were American property from birth. Takasaki expressed the opposite view, that because the salmon matured in the open ocean, they developed into an economically viable resource wholly independent from their natal streams. He accordingly prioritized the high seas fishery over inland rivers and onshore canneries. Now, Diamond first proposed extending maritime territoriality from 3 to 12 miles. He then revised his protectionist legislation to define Alaska's maritime territory as all waters less than 100 fathoms deep. Now, this would have placed all of the continental shelf, shown here in light blue, under U.S. jurisdiction. The shallow seabed of the Bering Sea extends hundreds of miles from the coast before dropping off to the abyssal plain, or the deep ocean floor. Excuse me. That the continental shelf is contiguous to the coast, and in fact an extension of the continent itself, bespoke to Diamond its territorial nature. So gradual is this seaward slope that Bristol Bay measures only 120 feet deep at its farthest edge, hundreds of miles from the coast. Diamond called the shelf a submarine bridge and noted, quote, "Just as the owner of a domicile has the right to eject trespassers from his doorstep, so I suggest in logic and reason a nation may justly exercise jurisdiction over the fisheries up to the edge of the shelf," close quote. Diamond heard from several Alaskans who supported his claims and suggested that the unique characteristics of the ocean floor might bolster his case. The dozens of streams and rivers that empty into Bristol Bay carry huge quantities of alluvium, loose, unconsolidated silt and soil. Because these rivers deposit that alluvium across the ocean floor, the continental shelf, or the doorstep in Diamond's metaphor, is literally covered with Alaskan soil, theoretically making it a submerged extension of the territory itself. W.J. Erskine, a merchant from Kodiak, wrote to Diamond and asked, quote, "Why cannot our government proclaim a policy on the theory that the alluvial deposits in the Bering Sea, originating in the territory now owned by it, have been solely responsible for the conditions which have made it possible for the fishes now present to breed, live, and thrive upon? Should those alluvial deposits raise the ocean floor high enough above the surface of the water, Alaska would certainly claim this newly formed land as its own, so why not make the identical claim to deposits on the ocean bottom?" Diamond took Erskine's advice. Now, this is where Gilbert and the others, they're not endorsing this plan, but Diamond took Erskine's advice, and while communicating Alaska's interests to other members of Congress, he would point to the Washington Monument and note that the Bristol Bay was less than the height of the Washington Monument, and if raised to that level, the seafloor would create a land bridge to the Soviet Union. Now, all of these issues, scientific and political, pivot in some important ways around the pioneer identity forged by the fishermen themselves. And here again is that rough and tumble gill netter from Bristol Bay. By virtue of its geographic position, Bristol Bay was an isolated, sparsely populated place continually plagued by fog and wind and rain and snow. Thus, the fishermen who braved this hostile environment year after year came to see themselves as frontiersmen, conquerors of a natural world, and possessors of a vested interest over the fish that took priority over all others. That the white fishermen, virtually without exception, had all migrated to Alaska from other locales further demonstrates how identity and culture are socially constructed forms that arise both from local experience and contrasts with the places that the emigrants left behind. Bristol Bay fishermen subsequently resented the Japanese for threatening their economic livelihoods, but just as importantly, for laying claim to a natural resource that by virtue of the toil and sacrifice necessary for its harvest was central to the created and constructed identities of these Alaskans. The Japanese invasion further sharpened this frontier identity by prodding white Alaskans to articulate precisely who they were, or who they thought they were, and who they were not. Because the Taiyu Maru controversy occurred the very same week as the Japanese invasion of China, a time of aggressive Japanese imperialism throughout the Pacific, Alaskans could frame their protectionist response as a stand against alien aggression at the same time that they self-identified as the rugged and indefatigable defenders of their home waters. I just realized it's sounding more and more like the Republican National Convention all the time, isn't it? Wow. In considering themselves frontiersmen, the white fishermen also positioned themselves as distinct and superior to other groups that used Bristol Bay, especially Alaska Natives and later the Japanese. The Alaska fishermen's supposed ownership of the ocean and its resources rested on two key assumptions. First, like residents of other frontier spaces in Western myth, white Alaskans conceived of Bristol Bay as an open virgin space that was theirs to enter, occupy, subdue, and exploit. They saw themselves as opening up the frontier, but in reality, they were fishing waters that the indigenous peoples had used for generations. And then second, maintaining that frontier myth required the newcomers to conveniently ignore the presence of Alaska Natives, whose claim to colonial subjugation no doubt exceeded the white fishermen's in both duration and degree. The salmon fishery was thus structured along racial and ethnic lines. Whites not only owned and operated the vessels and canneries, they also maintained an exclusive hold on the regulatory apparatus and the means with which to petition and protest. Alaska Natives and the predominantly Asian immigrant cannery workforce participated on subordinate terms if they participated at all. So in this sense then, the social geography of race demarcated the boundaries of the fishery in different but no less important ways than the actual physical migrations of the salmon themselves. In addition, the Alaskans contrasted Japan's supposedly rapacious and ultimately destructive fishing practices with their own careful, sustainable, scientifically based methods that were the very foundation of the valuable Bristol Bay salmon fishery. Here we see a cartoon from the Seattle PI in April 1937 that depicts the Japanese as a ravenous cat despoiling the fishery while a horrified Uncle Sam and Mother Canada look on. Now, individualistic Alaskans often bristled at congressional meddling and the promulgation of regulations by the Federal Fisheries Bureau, yet they saw no contradiction in citing those very management practices as evidence of domestic ownership of the resource. Because fishery regulations in Bristol Bay mandated 50% escapement, which I mentioned before, the identity of Alaska fishermen was as much a function of the fish that they did not catch as the ones that they did. The Japanese factory ships and trawlers stood to upset this balance, perhaps to the long-term detriment of the fishery as a whole, thus threatening white Alaskans' livelihoods and culture. Oh, Terrence would love this if he was here. Adherence to that 50% escapement rule, along with regulations that prohibited certain types of nets and motorized vessels, thus restricting Alaskans to wooden sailboats, represented a practice of self-limitation, an intentional repudiation of the most efficient fishing methods for the long-term health of the resource. This brand of conservation suggests that fishermen's identity depended in part on the effort investing in facilitating the salmon's escape, not its capture. Now, historian John Dower has written that in the years immediately before and during the Second World War, the Japanese, quote, were perceived as a race apart, even a species apart, close quote, and that the language used to describe them, treacherous, ruthless, depraved, and so on, served as racist code words designed to portray the Japanese as inferior beings who could be understood only in terms of mental primitivism. More important, Americans' formulaic expressions of racial hatred relied on stereotypes that Westerners had applied to non-whites for centuries and reflected larger anxieties, often about social and economic concerns. In decrying the inability or the unwillingness of the Japanese to devise and implement conservation measures in their own fisheries, Alaskans did not simply articulate their apprehension about the future of Bristol Bay, but questioned both the intelligence and the humanity of the Japanese. Comments made by Senator Louis Schwellenbach of Washington are representative in this regard. Quote, if the Japanese are able to cork up our Alaska fisheries as they have their own fisheries, the supply will soon be depleted, and it is understandable that they will proceed south by the coast of British Columbia to the states of Washington, Oregon, and California, close quote. For Schwellenbach and others, Japan's encroachment pointed to the contemptible nature of the Japanese themselves and therefore necessitated their total exclusion from Alaska waters, lest the savages, of course, expand the invasion further south. Such formulations contributed to the construction of a highly racialized fishery in which the white Alaska fishermen presumed to occupy a position of superiority and exclusivity. Here you see Captain Shields distributing rifles to his crew and threatening to shoot any Japanese vessels they see. Thankfully, this did not occur. Now, forgive me if I'm belaboring the point here, but these examples show that the construction of borders in the North Pacific may have had scientific findings as a foundation, but this process cannot be separated from the politics, the economics, and the social geography of race, class, and even the frontier identity of Alaskans themselves. I'm going to speed through to the end of this particular story and say that while Diamond's legislation was not enacted into law, President Harry Truman, shown here catching a salmon on a visit to the Pacific Northwest, issued a proclamation in September 1945 that did indeed extend sovereignty over the continental shelf. He did so for the purpose of offshore oil drilling and to protect Alaska's fisheries. Now, I'd like to leave you with one last image. After the Second World War, the United States, Canada, and Japan negotiated a tripartite agreement called the North Pacific Fisheries Convention, under which those three nations jointly managed both fishing as well as scientific studies of salmon. And they did so by demarcating boundaries on the open seas. By this point, it should surprise none of you that the result looked something like this one map of many that's in the convention itself. There it is. Boundaries that, of course, no salmon will recognize or respect. Now, I don't mean to be caustic about this or flippant. The agreement is actually a very powerful tool for international collaboration and the management of what remain a healthy species, relatively speaking. But these maps are so great in that they do help me to prove my thesis. Okay, I actually lied. I have a couple more slides. Now, I always tell my students that your thesis, your argument, should come in the first couple paragraphs of your paper or the first few minutes of your presentation, right? Your audience, your readers have to know what the point is. And you all know by this point that my thesis here is that science and borders on the ocean go together like peanut butter and jelly. Now, I'm going to break my own rule here, and I'm actually going to introduce a new thesis at the end of my presentation. What I'm really talking about here is not actually borders. It's empire. Commercial fishing in the Pacific Ocean in the 20th century, not just for salmon, but for halibut and for tuna and other species that dwell far from Alaska waters, was an exercise in economic imperialism. Now, at the start of my talk, I referred to the settlement of the American West in the 19th century, something historians are still discussing and debating. The settlement of the Pacific, in many ways, is the defining history of America in the 20th century. Consider the Philippines, China, Japan, Midway, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Wake Island, Hiroshima, the Cold War, nuclear testing in Bikini Atoll, Godzilla, for God's sake. Just as William Henry Seward predicted in 1867, the Pacific was the grand theater of history since that time. And as I am writing in my dissertation, commercial fishing expansion into the Pacific, ever deeper into the Pacific, went hand in hand with American geopolitical hegemony. This is essentially a story of empire. Now, the last slide, I promise, coming up. When you work on biography, and essentially what I'm writing is a scientific biography of these salmon scientists, you develop a real kinship with your subjects. Today I've mentioned David Starr Jordan and Charles Henry Gilbert, but I'm also studying the lives and careers of these other men, John Nathan Cobb, William Francis Thompson, Wilbert McLeod Chapman, all of whom were students of the professor who came before. And I feel, when you write biography, you get to know your subject, and I feel as though these men, all of whom are long deceased, have become in a way my friends and my colleagues, and I really love the fact that they always use their full names. And so in that spirit, I am informing you tonight that henceforth, I shall be known as Ross Allen Coen. All right, hey, that was pretty good. It's 7:56, and now we're done. All right, I know that there are some other events happening. I think there's a concert at 8 or something, so if anybody needs to leave right now for another event, that's fine. Now is the time. No offense taken. But otherwise, we've got plenty of time for discussion or Q&A. Sir, in the back.
point when somebody suggested a 200-mile nautical mile limit?
The question is, in my research, have I discovered the exact point when someone suggested a 200-mile nautical limit?
I know when it was first proclaimed by a nation, which I think was Argentina in 1943. But the question is, where did it come from?
Yeah, where did it come from? I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I know Anthony Diamond mentioned it, but whether or not he was probably not the first, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question about the 200-mile limit. When you go through the literature, there are any number of proposals for expanding territoriality. One of the things that I write about more comprehensively, I glossed over it in my presentation today, but when Diamond defined territoriality not by surface distance but by ocean depth, I think that's a really key conceptual way for understanding this ownership of the ocean, because now you're considering not merely surface distance with everything below some kind of mystery, but if you define it by all waters less than 100 fathoms deep, that seems to encompass the entire range of the ocean. I think there's something significant there.
Well, Truman in his proclamation said that the tuna, wherever they go, they're ours.
Yeah. And one of the other things that I glossed over and didn't have time to talk about was that the Truman Proclamation backfired in some very significant ways because, of course, once the United States extends territorial to the continental shelf, it frees up Peru to do the same and tell all the tuna boat, the clippers from San Diego, it was time for them to get out. So it was very much a double-edged sword.
Which we strongly objected to, but now we've adopted it.
Right. Dan.
Have you run across any place in there where people propose that the concept of salmon traps is actually the most efficient way of doing salmon? Do away with all these thousands of motors and little people out in little boats running around catching fish in small nets, and just efficiently set up a cannery right there or a freezer works right at the mouth of each stream, and counting the number of fish going by and letting out, doing the 50% escaping or whatever they want.
Dan, you're a brave man saying those words out loud in Alaska.
Eliminate 90% of the fishing jobs.
Yeah, the question, if you didn't hear Dan, was about the fact that fish traps, for as much as they were hated in Alaska, and in many ways the basis of the statehood movement, are a much more efficient means for catching salmon than boats and engines and everybody running around out on the sea. There was a graduate student in the Northern Studies program whose name is escaping me at the moment. I have it in my notes. He wrote a thesis essentially about that. Oh no, I'm thinking of somebody else. But you're right. I mean, fish traps are more, they were more, in the 1940s and 50s, fish traps were more a symbol of the resentment that Alaskans had toward outsiders, especially Seattle-based canners, than they were a complaint about the operation of the gear itself.
I mean, you keep the fish fresh and in the salt water, and you take them in as fast as you can. You can take them, and you don't wind up with too many at one time. Sounds like a great scheme.
Yeah. Yeah. Walk into a fisherman's bar in Homer or on Alaska and start talking like that.
You wouldn't walk out.
No, you wouldn't walk out. Question?
Yeah, I'm curious how you feel scientific research on salmon and management decisions that are informed by that research have changed since this era that you talked about tonight, and in what ways we haven't learned lessons from history.
The nice thing about being a historian is I don't have to know that, right? I get to stop whenever I want to. 1940 seems like a good place to stop. No, I take your question, though. But I have an answer for you. I'm not going to cop out. I have an answer for you. The research that I'm doing, looking into the Fisheries Bureau from the 1890s forward, the confidence that these men had that they knew precisely how to manage salmon populations, both for economic return, but for the long-term viability of the species, is astounding. Their confidence was unbounded. Gilbert was one of the first, that I found at least, to really introduce a precautionary principle, as with the cannery on the Yukon that he recommended be closed down. He couldn't prove definitively that it was to blame for poor fish runs, but he said, until we know more, it's best to shut the cannery down, right? So Gilbert acknowledges how much he doesn't know about salmon, and consequently his students, such as William Francis Thompson and then later Wilbert McLeod Chapman, they similarly had the same sort of humility when it came to their studies. So I think the difference, I can't speak to scientific methods precisely, but the difference that I see, I guess, between an earlier era and today is the humility that has entered the scientific discipline that was absent in these early years when they thought they knew exactly what they were doing. How's that?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes?
Manifest destiny. My question kind of is, that sounds like another century later, you know, that it's still being applied, or was being applied, 20s, 30s, 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And my question kind of is, really have the natives ever been given back their share, or maybe they've wrested it away a little bit
Mm-hmm.
by still being around to be able to pick up permits? But it sounds like it never stopped.
No, you're right. Manifest Destiny is a pretty powerful force.
Yeah.
And Pacific Fisherman, that trade magazine that I mentioned, such a fascinating read because the editor was a real sort of Manifest Destiny American, enterprise kind of guy. And the editorials, I read you the one, but the magazine is full of this type of very triumphant, very this is our birthright sort of expand fisheries all the way to Japan, all the way to the Philippines. And the assumption there that undergirds this, that underlies this belief is you're right, this notion of American exceptionalism. And I don't think there is ever adequate room for the perspectives of indigenous peoples or marginalized populations in any version of that exceptionalism. That's what I would say. You had your hand up before, and then I'll come back here.
The question I have is, a few years ago, Russia exerted territorial claims going from their continental shelf pretty much all the way to the North Pole. So my question was, after post-World War II, the agreement that was drawn up, how did at that time, Soviet Union figure into all this, or did they?
Yeah, the question is about the Soviet Union figuring into this tripartite agreement, the post-war that I mentioned. The Soviet Union did not initially, but later became part of that joint international management regime. But you're right. I mean, another story to be told here is the Cold War legacy of American fisheries. For example, one of the chapters that I'm writing for my dissertation, is about tuna fishing in the Philippines after the Second World War. And the independence was granted to the Philippines in 1946, but it really wasn't independence because America maintained economic ties that were certainly beneficial to American industry. And the invitation to American seafood companies to go into the Philippines to exploit the tuna fisheries there is an example of exactly that economic hegemony that I'm talking about. However, you could also say that by allowing for American investment in the Philippines, it creates a bulwark against communism on this global trans-Pacific scale in that early Cold War era. You can't extricate American economic expansion from political prerogatives vis-a-vis the Cold War era, right? There was an office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from about 1940 up until the 1960s called the Foreign Fishery Service, I think is what it was called. And these were fisheries advisors, all Americans, who went all over the world, primarily to third world countries, to advise them on how to build up their fisheries, right? Well, this is sort of an aid package. This is a bulwark against communism masquerading as an aid package. And in fact, when you go to the National Archives, as I've done, and you request the materials on this office, some of these materials are still classified. For example, the Fisheries Bureau sent fisheries advisors to Iran in the early 1950s, and those records are not available. Why? Certainly there were fisheries advisors / CIA agents helping to, overthrow in the coup. So I'm sorry, I'm going far afield from your question, but basically you can't separate politics from economics in this entire sphere. Yeah. Sir, question.
Well, I'm interested in any parallels you may have come across regarding the Eastern Russian fisheries, vis-a-vis either nationalist interests or economic interests or non-American but yet imperialist activity in that area.
Yeah, the thing that occurs to me, and I can't speak in depth about it because it's sort of on my research list, but I haven't gotten to it yet, is that after the Russian-Japanese War of 1904, 1906, Japan gained entrance to all of the Siberian and Kamchatkan salmon fisheries. That lasts up until the early 1930s, when the now Soviet Union attempts to eject the Japanese, using many of the same arguments, actually, that the Alaskans attempted, right? That these that the Russians, Soviets, by this point, have a proprietary interest, that these are territorial waters, those sorts of things.
Are they running the same theory that we are?
I don't know about that. I don't know. I haven't gone into the Russian science with regard to that, so I'm not equipped to answer that. But it's certainly an interesting avenue to pursue.